Dettelbach has stepped down, and it's the perfect storm for a serious shakeup in the ATF. This might be our one shot at putting someone in charge who genuinely aims to rein in what many of us see as a runaway bureaucracy. In this video, we'll talk about the two big names floating around for the next ATF director, and why it matters for every one of us who cares about the Second Amendment. For far too long, Biden's ATF has run unchecked, with the anti-gun genius known as Steve Dettelbach writing anti-gun regulations left and right that go well beyond what the Constitution allows. Now that Stevie has resigned, there's an opportunity to either continue business as usual or send a shockwave of reform through an organization that has been criticized for decades. Imagine if instead of letting it coast, we should put someone deserving in the captain's chair, someone who's going to shred the agency's authority from within. That's what's at stake here, an appointment that could be the difference between real reform and more of the same shenanigans. So the next big question is, who should lead the ATF if it's going to be led at all? I would argue that the position should remain vacant, as it often has in the past. But what do I know? Besides, this is a chance to place a pro-2A figure at the helm. Someone who will not just walk the line, but actively fight to dismantle everything the ATF has done that oversteps the Constitution. That's where this debate about Blake Masters versus Brandon Herrera kicks into high gear. On one side, you've got Blake Masters, a businessman and wannabe politician who's made some videos with guns, claims he supports the Second Amendment, but has zero proven record in office. On the other side, you have Brandon Herrera, a guy knee-deep in the firearms industry, known for calling out ATF nonsense at every turn, and someone who's personally felt the regulatory heat. Let's talk about Blake Masters first. This is a man who's tried his hand at politics more than once, ran for Senate in 2022, lost in the general after beating his primary challengers, then tried to run for the House in 2024 and lost in the primary. So what do we know about him besides the fact that he can't seem to win an election? Well, he's a businessman with a decent amount of success under his belt, and he's not a career politician. In theory, that could be a good thing. We don't always want someone from the swamp to fill every position. Sometimes a fresh perspective is valuable, but the issue is that, from everything I've seen, Masters isn't exactly a dyed-in-the-wool Second Amendment activist. He's shot some campaign videos with guns. There's one with him and a short-barreled rifle, and another with him firing a suppressed PPK, but beyond that surface-level stuff, we don't really have a record of him championing gun rights. One problem is that Masters comes off as a normie who discovered guns might help him win a Republican primary. For all the talk of being pro-2A, how often do we see him engaging with the nitty-gritty battles that matter, like fighting against the constant attempts to redefine what constitutes a firearm, or pushing back on the ATF's authority to just rewrite rules on braces and triggers and so forth? That's the central concern. Sure, he says the right words in his videos, and yes, I respect that he's willing to hold a short-barreled rifle in front of a camera, because that alone can upset a certain segment of the political spectrum. But does that mean he's willing to walk into the ATF, pick up the biggest hammer available, and start smashing down walls? That's unclear. Another major point with Masters is his loyalty to Trump. Now, I'm not trying to bash Trump nor sing his praises, but it's no secret Trump's Second Amendment record isn't all sunshine and rainbows. We shouldn't forget that this is the man who once said, "Take the guns first, go through due process second." That's a pretty direct line from the man himself. If you align yourself too closely with that mindset, the question is whether you'll stand firm on core constitutional issues or whether you'll do what the president wants, even if it conflicts with the letter of the law. Trump might say a lot of things that sound pro-gun to rally a voter base, but when push came to shove on things like bump stocks, the administration took an approach that circumvented the legislative process. So if Masters is 100% loyal to Trump, we have to wonder if he would go along with the same kind of overreach or try to check it. On top of that, Masters seems to be someone who's just desperately seeking any position of power he can find. He's run for Senate and failed, then ran for House and failed, and apparently has asked for a job in the White House Personnel Office and been turned down. So maybe the ATF directorship is just the next rung on the ladder. That's not the kind of person I trust to walk into the lion's den of the ATF and actually slash its budget or curtail its regulatory mission. He's more likely to sit there, sign off on the same old nonsense, and maybe pose for a photo op with a scary-looking rifle whenever he needs to rally support. I think we need someone who's got a personal vendetta against the ATF, someone who views that agency as an existential threat to our constitutional rights. I think we need an insider from the gun community who's been hassled by the agency enough times to be truly motivated to dismantle it. But who do you think that someone should be? Comment below. I genuinely want to hear your thoughts, because this debate is bigger than just one person's rant. Now let's pivot to Brandon Herrera, affectionately known in some pro-2A circles as the AK guy. He's not just some business type who popped into the firearms scene for campaign clout, he lives in it. He makes content about guns, especially AK pattern rifles, has a significant following, and is known for being outspoken about the ATF's overreach. He tried his hand at politics too. He ran for Congress, but he lost in the primary. Some people might say that shows he doesn't have the political chops. But here's the difference. Herrera doesn't strike me as someone whose main motivation is to wield power. Rather, he's the type of guy who would step into the ATF's top job specifically to break the organization from the inside. That's not me putting words in his mouth either. He's pretty open about his stance that the ATF should be gutted or abolished altogether. You might ask, well, why does it matter that he's an industry insider? Because the ATF doesn't just regulate a faceless concept called firearms. It actually interacts with, and often penalizes, the real businesses and individuals that keep the industry going. Someone who's had to handle paperwork, who's probably had compliance checks, or who's aware of the labyrinth of contradictory rules would be far more likely to see just how deeply flawed the entire system is. And that's exactly the perspective we need if we're serious about making the ATF the smallest, least intrusive version of itself, if we can't eliminate it entirely. The average everyday person might not realize how the ATF operates. They might assume the agency's just catching criminals, but in reality, it's often stumbling into law-abiding citizens' lives, turning them into criminals over paperwork errors or minor technicalities. Herrera knows that, because he's in the trenches. Another point in Herrera's favor, at least from my standpoint, is that he'd never be buddy-buddy with an administration that tries to ban things by executive fiat. If Trump were to say something like, "We need to ban X accessory, no legislation needed," a guy like Herrera might well go, "Nope, that's not constitutional, and I'm not enforcing it." Now, I'm not saying that's guaranteed. Politics is a messy game, but if we're picking a candidate to lead a powerful agency, I want the one who's stated time and again his open hostility toward that ATF's very existence. That's about as close to a sure thing as we can get in the swamp that is Washington, D.C. There is, however, one challenge. Herrera is an outsider in the sense that he's not a polished politician and doesn't have a track record of winning elections. He lost his primary, just like Masters eventually lost his general election. But Herrera's entire brand is authenticity and passion for the cause. Maybe that's exactly what we need in the ATF director's seat, though some might question if the political machine would even allow a guy like that to slip through the cracks into an actual official role. The system tends to favor the well-connected, and Herrera's more of a grassroots, rebellious figure. That might be a big hurdle. It's also worth mentioning that some folks worry Herrera's fiery, sometimes tongue-in-cheek approach might alienate people who could otherwise be allies. In a bureaucratic job, you often have to do a bit of politicking to get anything done. If you come in guns blazing, pun intended, the rest of the staff might just lock up and refuse to cooperate. But to that I say, the ATF is not exactly a friend to the firearms community. If the staff locks up and refuses to do anything, maybe that's exactly how you neutralize an agency that has overreached for decades. Freeze it in place, starve it of momentum. That's the dream scenario for those who believe the ATF shouldn't exist in the first place. Which leads us to the bigger philosophical question, do we even want someone to run the ATF, or is it better to keep the seat empty or abolished altogether? In many ways, the best scenario for those of us who value the Second Amendment is a powerless ATF. But if the government insists on appointing a director, then we'd better push for someone who'll do everything possible to reduce the agency's scope. And between Masters and Herrera, it's pretty clear who's more likely to do that. Let me be blunt. I think Brandon Herrera is the better choice if the goal is to gut the ATF and salt the earth behind it. But what do you think? Comment below, because your perspective might shed light on angles I haven't even considered. We should also talk about how big of a role Trump is playing in these speculations. There's a sense that he'll surround himself with loyalists who will carry out his orders, no questions asked. That can be good or bad, depending on the orders, but historically, Unconditional loyalty to a president can lead to some dangerous territory, especially when it comes to rewriting rules or skipping due process. The best appointments in my mind are the ones that act as a constitutional safeguard, not a rubber stamp for whichever occupant sits in the White House. Whether you love or hate Trump, giving him a director who'll say yes sir to anything could easily backfire if the idea of a gun grab or some new executive overreach resurfaces. We need someone with principles, not just a thirst for power. There's also the matter of how each candidate interacts with the broader firearms community. Masters might pop up at a range once in a while or do the occasional tweet. But when you think of the gun world on social media, names like Brandon Herrera, Michael Jones of Garand Thumb, and others, okay, scratch Michael Jones. The point is, Masters just doesn't come to mind. He's not part of that fabric. That might sound trivial, but it speaks volumes about who's actually living and breathing this fight for gun rights. The ATF director's job is, in essence, to oversee the enforcement or non-enforcement of firearms laws. If that person doesn't intimately understand the impact of those laws on real gun owners, we'll end up with more bungled decisions, more senseless paperwork, and more harassment of law-abiding citizens. Consider also that Masters apparently does CrossFit, which the original rant points out as a sign of potentially questionable judgment. A little jab, sure, but it speaks to the comedic side of how some in the gun community view trendy things. It's less about CrossFit itself and more about the vibe. A guy chasing the next big fad or next big position. Herrera, by contrast, is consistently in the business of producing firearms content and addressing real issues that matter to gun enthusiasts and 2A purists. That's a huge difference in authenticity. If the role of ATF director is to be forced upon us, I'd rather see it occupied by someone who's absolutely fed up with the agency's nonsense. In the end, we have to decide which direction we want the ATF to go. If we want it reined in, or ideally abolished, we need someone with a personal stake in seeing it dismantled. That's Herrera. If we just want an easy stand-in who might posture here and there, but ultimately keep the gears turning, that's Masters. I know where I stand, but I also know that not everyone in the pro-2A world agrees on tactics. How about you? Where do you stand? Let us know in the comments. Maybe you know of someone who's better than Brandon Herrera. If you made it this far, please like, share, subscribe, and click on the bell icon for more of these videos. Thanks for watching.